trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing because they were afraid. These are the last words of Mark's Gospel. Now, if you were following in the Bibles that are in your seats, you'd have seen that there are a further 11 verses printed there. But these verses were added much later, cobbled together from other sources. Someone clearly felt that Mark's Gospel ended too abruptly. But that someone was not the writer that we call Mark. Perhaps his brevity indicates that there is so much that we cannot know about this thing that we call resurrection. If you were counting, you would have noticed that Mark devotes just 8 verses to the resurrection. In them, he names 3 women who go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. He tells us when they went, very early on the first day of the week. He tells us that they were concerned about how they would get into the tomb. He tells us that they saw that the stone which had covered the entrance was already rolled away, and that they met an unidentified, unnamed young man dressed in white, and that they were alarmed. Mark also tells us that the young man had a message for these 3 women. He says, Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified, has risen. He is not here. See, he says, the tomb is now empty. And then he tells the women to go to tell the disciples, and Peter in particular, that they are to go to Galilee, where they will see Jesus. And then comes that final line, in which Mark tells us that instead of doing what they'd been told, the women fled and told no one. And that's it. That's all he says about what we now regard as the central event of our faith. Just think for a moment what's missing. There's no conversation with Mary Magdalene in the garden. There's no appearance in an upper room. There's no conversation with a skeptical Thomas. There's no walk to Emmaus. There's no cooking fish on the shore of Galilee. There's no miraculous catch of fish. There's no great commission, no telling the disciples to go and preach the good news and baptize all nations. And there's no ascension. Why? We might well wonder. Fair enough, someone else has added some of these in. But it wasn't Mark. I think we could fairly readily come up with a couple of possibilities to explain why Mark says so little. Perhaps he had not heard the stories that the other Gospels contain. But intriguingly, just like with the Christmas stories, none of the major post-Easter stories appear in more than one Gospel. It seems really unlikely that if Mark had heard these stories, he would have chosen to leave them out. Or the other possibility is that perhaps these stories that appear in the other Gospels had not yet begun to be told when Mark was working. It may help to remind ourselves about something of the nature and development of the Gospels. First, chronology. While this is still being debated, most scholars agree that Mark is the oldest Gospel, and then came Matthew, Luke, and John. None of them, though, are as old as Paul's letters, at least not the genuine letters of Paul. And strangely, one might think, Paul says almost nothing of the earthly life or the death or the resurrection of Jesus. Instead, he says a great deal about his personal experience of the risen Christ. But for any stories of Jesus' life, we have to, as it were, wait for the Gospels to be written. It's thought that Paul was writing in around about the 50s AD, Mark in the 60s, Matthew and Luke in the 70s and 80s, and John a little later in the first decade or so of the first century AD. More than 70 years after the events of Jesus' life. Even Mark was writing 30 years or more after the death of Jesus. I wonder, how detailed are your memories of events and conversations of 30 years ago? Some of them, I'm sure, are and will be vivid in your minds. But we know that memory is always about reconstruction rather than reproduction. That's just how our minds work. And how detailed are your memories of events and conversations which took place 30 years or more ago, involving people that you did not personally know, but which have later been described to you by someone else? I doubt if any of them are other than hazy. I know if I could even think of one, mine would be. Now, I'm saying this because we need to recognize that every story and every saying that we read in the Gospels has been passed down by word of mouth, by telling and retelling for anything between about 30 and 80 years. Passed down in spoken form before being written down. None of the Gospels are history in the sense that they accurately and dispassionately record events. And this is the second point, and in many ways the more crucial. Though based on memory, traditions handed down, all of the Gospels are principally meditations on the meaning of Jesus. They are all meta-parables. But does this mean that we should say that the sources and accounts that we read in the Bible cannot be relied upon? No, certainly not. For a start, we're talking about a society in which memory played a bigger part than it does for us. There was much less information to remember. There were hardly any books, so people had to remember things. And to state the obvious, there was no Google. People remembered, and they had techniques for remembering. Their minds were more adept at it than ours are. And they remembered in the form of story, because stories are good vehicles for truth, good vehicles for things that you need to know, for things that you need to understand. And they understood, probably better than we do, just how powerful stories are. That, surely, is why Jesus told so many stories, and why so many of them were remembered and passed on. But more important than these cultural considerations is the fact that these stories were told and remembered and retold in communities which were fundamentally shaped by them. They weren't told for entertainment to while away a winter's night. They were told because these stories changed people's lives in profound ways. The telling of these stories, the stories of Jesus of Nazareth, bound people together in a way that they should do for us, but maybe seem less and less to do. They were living stories, not relegated to somewhere in the cultural background. And the communities which treasured these stories were acutely aware of the fact that they would not exist as communities without these stories. And these were communities which held the absolute conviction that Jesus of Nazareth, whose life had had such a profound effect upon them, whom they knew had been crucified, had died, and was buried, was still a present reality in their lives. Though they could no longer see him, though he was no longer physically present, they were convinced that he was spiritually present, that he was giving them life. I don't think that it's possible to understand this without understanding something of Jesus' earthly life. And especially we need to remember that his whole life was a profound challenge to the domination systems of the world. He came to bring good news to the poor, to bring liberty to captives, release for the oppressed, and to proclaim the kingdom of God. What the world could be if God were king and the powers of the world were not. His was a profoundly political message, and his life and death embodied his absolute commitment to the kingdom of God. His was a life of opposition to all which keeps the poor in poverty, to all which binds and enslaves and oppresses, to all which denies and obscures the truth, and to all which opposes the loving will of God. It was for this that he died, victim of an attempt by the empire and their collaborators to silence him. Killing God's Son was the ultimate act of defiance by a wicked world against its ever-loving Creator. But would the world's wickedness have the last word? Would it win this ultimate battle? A few people, a few women and men of Galilee and Bethany knew the truth. Not even death could silence the Son of God. Doubtless some had visions of the risen Christ, but many more, as John says, believed because even though they had not seen. And it is to the testimony of these few people that we owe our faith. It is because of their witness that we have hope. It is through their conviction, born out of their experiences of the living Jesus and the risen Christ, that God would not, could not let oppression, injustice, and the domination of empire have the last word. That we are incorporated into the body of the living Lord, the true Lord of creation, and are able to answer the call to serve God and his kingdom in the sure and certain knowledge that God will prevail. Today, we look with Mary Magdalene, with Mary, the mother of James, and with Salome, into the mouth of an empty tomb. We may be bewildered. We may be fearful. But what we are looking at is the emptiness of the world's false promises, and at the awesome majesty of God, whom nothing can stop, not even death itself, as God leads all creation into everlasting peace, justice, and love. Amen.